Lifestream.net presents On the Way to a Smile, Case of Nanaki.
Oh, Gilligan, please be gone. Just what are you?
Nanaki, also known as Red 13, howled at the moon as he tried to rid himself of the darkness that had taken root in his heart. His howl echoed in the cold night on the plateau far in the distance. The red fur which covered his entire body was illuminated in the darkness by the blazing flame at the end of his agile tail. Nanaki received no response. It had always been the same, but this time, the silence of the world seemed to him like a sign. It seemed that he had to resolve the problem alone, because Gilligan was within him and was his enemy alone. He hadn't become aware of its existence until a few days ago. He tried to remember how Gilligan was born, that is, when it had taken up residence within him. At the end of his long journey with Cloud and the others to defeat Sephiroth and save the planet, Nanaki returned to his homeland, Cosmo Canyon. The people of the valley welcomed him with open arms after the epic battle and listened attentively to the account of his adventures. Nanaki was proud of himself and everything they had achieved. After that, he went to see his father. Long ago, the brave warrior Sito valiantly fought against the Gi tribe and now stood petrified, watching over the valley.
Father, you and Mother were great warriors who defended this valley. That is why I made it my mission to protect it, just as you did. And I think that I have succeeded. That is why I will be traveling again, Father. But this time I would prefer not to battle. I will look at life around the world. Chocobos being born, trees withering, and... well, I will look at as much as I can and learn to understand life around the world. Grandfather always told me. He told me that it is my duty to see everything, to remember it all, and pass on my knowledge to future generations. Oh, and...
Nanaki paused briefly and gazed over at his father, looking at his petrified eyes and ears before continuing.
And I will tell you everything too, Father. You can count on it.
He then announced his decision to the inhabitants of the village. He would obey the last words of his grandfather, Bugenhagen, and make it his new mission to embark on a long journey to record the world. They all encouraged him, reassuring him that his accumulated knowledge would be of significant importance to future generations, and that they would always be there for him. Leaving the village through the rugged terrain of the canyon, Nanaki followed the arduous path down for a while, and finally looked back. The people were still standing there, waving him goodbye. In response, he sat on his hind legs, stretched out his back, head up, and let out a loud howl.
I will be back. Until then, I bid you farewell.
With that, he ran down the rest of the path in a single breath. Before long, he arrived at a crag. There he would usually stop to look back at the village before leaving Cosmo Canyon. Once he passed this point, the village would finally disappear beyond the horizon. Nanaki wasn't about to break with this tradition. He looked up toward the village, but it was nowhere to be seen. A huge boulder that he was sure wasn't there before blocked his view.
Ah, yes.
It finally dawned on Nanaki. The Lifestream had come through here and had brought the rock with it. Since he had last been here, he noticed the shape of the land had changed here and there. He looked around carefully again and realized that parts of the canyon that had once protruded had been eroded away.
Well, it can't be helped. The changes aren't troubling anyone. Compared to cities like Midgar, where the extent of the destruction made the reconstruction much more difficult, they were lucky.
Nanaki leapt off the small boulder and continued his journey, paying close attention to the ground under his feet as he walked. Then, at some point he noticed a change. However, It wasn't a change in the landscape, but a change in him, in his body, in his mind. Nanaki stood still and closed his eyes. He looked deep into his heart.
There it is. But what is it? How do I describe it?
Nanaki wanted to be able to describe it with words. For him, words were the best way to capture a situation and understand it. It was pitch black. It was as though a gaping hole had suddenly opened in his heart. No, not like a hole. It was like a black lump. It was hard and dense. Suddenly he began to tremble. He felt like it had changed its form.
I wonder what it's changing into.
He wanted to make a sound, but the fear rendered him mute. Nanaki grit his teeth and tried to resist it, but he couldn't. He took a deep breath and ran back up the slope toward the village. The villagers were surprised to see him running back. Soon a crowd had gathered around him.
What's wrong, Nanaki?
He could feel the black lump was no longer there.
Don't tell us you're already getting homesick.
Maybe.
Nanaki, pull yourself together. You're supposed to be a brave warrior.
Yes, you're right.
For a while, Nanaki spoke to the people of the village before saying his goodbyes once again and heading on his way. He could have taken a different route, but he consciously decided to take the same path. He wanted to find out whether it was the place itself which had caused the sudden fear, but this time nothing happened. Gilligan. That was the name Nanaki had given the thing that had suddenly appeared in his heart and struck him with fear. The word Gilligan had no deeper meaning, but by giving it a name, Nanaki would surely not forget it. Names helped him remember certain events, and so Nanaki continued on his journey with Gilligan as an unwelcome dark passenger in his heart. Sometimes when he remembered it, he tried to fathom its true form, but each time he was gripped with fear. As long as he was unable to keep it under control, he would rather just keep Gilligan out of his consciousness. When Nanaki left Cosmo Canyon, he had a rough plan in mind. First, he would travel to the western continent, a narrow island which ran north to south, to visit Wutai, Yuffie's hometown. After exploring there, his journey would take him back east. He would travel the vast continent, starting with Sid's hometown, Rocket Town. Then on to Karel, Barrett's hometown. Then to Nibelheim, where Cloud and Tifa grew up. Then he would head north. He wanted to not only visit the villages, but also explore the remote, uninhabited areas. He had no idea how long all of this would take, but he wasn't worried. The life expectancy of his race was between 500 and 1,000 years. And in that lifetime, which surpassed any human life many times over, he wanted to ensure that he left a lasting legacy to the world.
But I must not behave recklessly. After all, I will be living on much longer than everyone else.
Nanaki was on his way to Wutai. If possible, he wanted to see Yuffie again. She was always playful and treated him as if he was her pet, but Nanaki just accepted it as her way of being friendly and learned to appreciate it.
Yuffie is easy to understand.
Even though she was surrounded by older companions, she had always tried to battle on par with them, almost as if she wanted to show that her age didn't matter at all when they stood together on the battlefield. Nanaki could understand that completely. Perhaps her intellectual age was comparable to his. He was now almost 50 and had always wondered why he only had the understanding of a 16-year-old. However, the intellectual development of his race always differed from that of humans, and at some point he had just given up thinking about it. As Nanaki approached Wutai, completely by chance, he spotted Yuffie in the distance. He really wanted to sneak up behind her and give her a fright, but somehow, as he watched her from a hilltop, he lost his nerve. She was walking backwards, dragging a boy her age by the ankles behind her toward the town. How far had they traveled already? The boy's body had certainly left a long trail in the grass. Nanaki couldn't see whether the boy was still alive or not, but he could see that Yuffie was trying to speak to him. A moment later, she suddenly stopped. At first he thought that she was taking a break, but far from it. Instead, she lifted the boy up and tried to carry him on her shoulder. However, Yuffie was exhausted, and it looked like she was having some difficulty.
Guess it can't be helped.
Nanaki headed in their direction. He was always happy to help, especially when others weren't expecting it. He quietly approached the unsuspecting Yuffie, walking softly.
Shall I give you some help?
It turned out that Yuri, Yuffie's friend, had become a victim of a disease that had recently become rampant in Midgar, whose most obvious symptom was a viscous black liquid which literally ran out of every pore on the body, spread fear and terror, because it inevitably ended with death. In Midgar, it was an even bigger problem than the difficult reconstruction. On his travels, Nanaki had heard rumors that the disease spread by contact with the infected, but Yuffie didn't seem the least bit concerned. However, Nanaki was concerned and wondered whether he should tell her about the rumors. But when he heard Yuffie and Yuri speaking, he quickly realized that she was already aware of the rumors about the risk of infection.
What's with this carelessness? No, wait. It's not carelessness. It's kindness. Yuffie. I don't know how close they are, but she couldn't just give up on her friend.
His thoughts turned to suspicion toward Yuri.
How could he take advantage of her kindness like that? What if she gets infected?
Nanaki was really angry, but of course, he had to accept the situation as it was. After all, it was Yuffie's friend, and her decision alone. When the conversation turned to materia which could surely cure the disease, he said, presumably to give vent to his annoyance, that such materia doesn't exist. Yuffie reacted angrily, but Nanaki had counted on it. What he hadn't expected, however, was the sadness in her eyes. Nanaki deeply regretted the contemptible words he had just said to her. Finally, they reached Wutai, and Nanaki spent a few days there. Yuffie took care of all of the patients that had now been placed under quarantine and isolation. Nanaki helped her with smaller tasks if she explicitly asked him. Otherwise, he tried to keep his distance and observe the disease. He was convinced that this was an event that he had to remember in order to preserve it for posterity. This was another facet of the great game of life.
Hey, is it true you can speak?
Yes.
This is unfathomable. Why would a being like you be created? Your soul must have been mistakenly put in the wrong body. You must always wish to be human, right?
Those words confounded Nanaki, but a realization came to him. Having the same thoughts and emotions as humans allowed him to observe and understand them, and it was his duty to pass on this knowledge of the evolution of the human race to future generations of humans. Nanaki was glad that he now understood his duty a little better.
Now I've learned another thing.
Nanaki would have had no objection to staying in Wutai for a while to observe the patients and to spend time with Yuffie, but she ordered him to collect more information about the disease, and so he left. He was about to enter the lowlands and turned back one last time to look at Wutai in the distance before it disappeared from his sight. He was sure that from here he would still be able to see Yuffie at work in the makeshift hospital, but the whole place was suddenly no longer visible. Apparently he had already entered the lowlands without noticing, and because of the sweeping valley, Wutai had now disappeared from view.
Oh well, I'll just have to come again sometime.
Nanaki was about to continue on his journey, when suddenly he was gripped with fear. It was Gilligan. It had resurfaced. Nanaki focused his whole consciousness on Gilligan, trying to find out once and for all what it had to do with him. The black lump trembled, and suddenly something came to the surface. They were the faces of the people at Cosmo Canyon. Their friendly faces appeared, only to be immediately swallowed up by the darkness.
Those faces just now. Who?
When he realized he couldn't remember the names, his whole body began to tremble. The shaking was so intense that he was unable to stand and had to sit down on his hind legs.
Oh, come on, remember their names.
Nanaki encouraged himself. Another face appeared from the darkness. It was Gilligan. It had a peaceful expression, one that Nanaki had never seen before. Then it started to sink back into the Black Sea. Suddenly, thoughts of death shot through Nanaki's mind.
Are the people of the valley going to die? Yuffie too?
Once again, Nanaki felt the crippling fear.
Help me.
He cowered on the ground, his whole body trembling as he called out for the planet's protection. Inspired by misplaced hope that it could hear him, he wanted to shout out again, but Gilligan suddenly disappeared once again. Nanaki slowly stood up and looked around. He ran up the valley and saw Wutai on the horizon. He saw Yuffie hard at work. Someday, Yuffie too would grow old and die, and most of the people of the valley were already quite old. They would all die even sooner. Just the thought of it made Nanaki sad. Certainly he would cry with grief and would be depressed for a long time. But why had Gilligan caused him to panic at the thought of the deaths of people he knew?
Is that Gilligan's true form? The fear I feel when the time came when my friends die.
Nanaki shook his head to rid himself of these detrimental thoughts.
One day the time will surely come. But now is not the time to think about my friends' deaths.
Nanaki changed his plans and decided to investigate the Midgar disease, as Yuffie and the people of Wutai called it. And where else could he learn more about this disease than Midgar itself? On one hand, the more information there was, the more contradictory things would probably get. On the other hand, the pensive Cloud and clever Tifa were in Midgar. Nanaki was therefore quite sure that he would gain valuable insights if he stayed there for a while.